Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. It's Annabelle, and in today's video we are going to be looking at my little seedlings that I deflasked with you guys. These were purchased from Roellke Orchideen in Germany, and unfortunately 2 out of the 3 flasks I bought came contaminated and with kind of severe fungal growth inside the little flasks. Now these were kind of a secondary stage flask, so initially they would have been seeded into a much larger flask, and then at a later stage, maybe 2 or 3 flaskings later, the flask that we got would have been made. So essentially they would have taken those seedlings, changed the media a few times, put them into smaller flasks with just a few seedlings in, and then that's what I got. So I had to deflask these pretty much upon arrival. I waited a few days to get some equipment in and then did it, but they were far too small to be deflasked really. I kind of had to do it. When you get contamination in a flask, your best bet is to deflask immediately, and if you don't have sterile conditions where you can sterilize the orchids and reflask, that's it, they have to be taken out of their flasks. The little sterile baby orchids don't actually need to be sterile, but their media that they're growing in needs to be sterile, because obviously in the wild they would have mycorrhizae fungi which scavenge all the nutrients for them, which we can't really replicate so much in a home environment. So we flask in a complete media which contains all of the nutrients that baby orchids need to grow. Unfortunately, it also contains all the nutrients and moisture that bacteria and fungi need to grow. So they can very rapidly take over a flask if there is contamination, and that can then damage the orchids. So at that point they do need to be dealt with. So we've got my orchids. I put half into a Seramis mix from each flask and half into a moss bark perlite mix from each flask, both in similar conditions, little cups with leca filled at the bottom and then kind of a wicking self-watering type system, because seedlings obviously need to be kept quite moist. They're coming out of a flask environment where the humidity is going to be like 100%, and they're very, very sensitive. They need a lot of moisture. Seedlings just in general need more moisture, but particularly coming out of a flask, they're going to be even more sensitive to that massive humidity drop that's going to happen initially. And I found that a lot of the roots that they had dried up. In the moss, several of them rotted, which not ideal. I have dealt with seedlings before and grown them in moss, and I didn't have an issue. But thinking about it, my humidity in the grow room is probably higher now than it was then because I've got more plants. So maybe my approach needed to differ slightly from my previous experience. Anyway, it's all a learning curve, and I've recorded the process so you guys can kind of bear that in mind. My humidity isn't massively high in the grow room, kind of ranges between 60 and 70% at the moment. Obviously it's winter at the moment, so the humidity is on the high side compared to in summer. Even though that we've got all the heating and fans on, we've had a very, very wet winter this year, and we're near the coast anyway, so the humidity tends to stay relatively high. And the grow room's been staying between 18 and 25 degrees Celsius, just for reference. And they've been under a LED under counter, like kitchen type light, so not like a full-on high-powered grow light, but given a good light source to help them out. With regard to the rot issues that I had, it was kind of a weird conflict because I had some seedlings rotting and some, like, the aerial roots were just drying out. So just they were having a bad time, pretty much a consequence of them being removed from the flask too early, I think. So I guess that's a learning experience, but I didn't have that many other options, so I kind of feel quite sad about it. My Seramis seedlings in general seem to have fared a little bit better than my moss seedlings. So we're going to go over each cross individually, and we can take a look at the comparison and how they're doing now. So first up, we're going to look at my RLC Cordelia, and this is Cattleytonia intermedia crossed with Angraecum digbyana. So this has been the most vigorous of the seedlings that I purchased from Roellke. Probably the easiest grower, and definitely one that I would recommend as a first kind of flasking experience for people. So going to take a look first at this one that we've got in Seramis. Got some really good root growth down into the Seramis pumice mix that it's in. One modification that I did have to make with the Seramis seedlings was to take that pebble top layer off the top because it was too dry. Completely dried out a couple of my root tips, so I had to take it all off, so it's just Seramis on the top, which they seem to respond to really well. The pebbles were only there to stop algae growth, which we haven't really had. And my moss ones seem to also be doing well. Have had a few instances where a couple of the very tiny ones rotted, and we've just got this very, very baby one here, which started trying to produce a root, which then kind of dried up. It's a little bit odd. Just try and show you a slightly closer shot of the roots. Don't seem to have quite so many roots down into the pot in this moss, and they first seem to have dried a bit. Can you see some sort of brown marks on the roots there? They've dried and then kind of continued growing, particularly on this root here. And got another root up there that's dried up. What we do have is the first big new growth on the moss one. So, seems to be doing okay. Not like as impressed as I thought I was going to be with the moss, but it could just be how I've kept them. To start with, I kept them in a little humidity tray in a heat mat, but I found it too humid, and obviously I was getting rot issues, so I removed that pretty immediately. I seem to have had a combination of too much and too little humidity, which I can't really explain, but anyway, this is my RLC Cordelia, and it's a very vigorous hybrid, so these seedlings have been a joy to grow. Next up, we have a slightly sadder story. So, unfortunately, of this cross, most of the moss seedlings have lost all their roots and many of them rotted. So this is a Sophronitis hybrid, and it's been extremely fussy. So this is Sophronitis Arizona crossed with Cattleytonia red rum, and it did say sort of medium to hard difficulty level as a note, which I ignored and maybe shouldn't have. Maybe I should have just gone for more easy to grow seedlings for a first proper flask attempt. The ones in Seramis do seem to have done better. I think it's quite clear, just judging from the way that they look. I do have one which kind of lost all its roots and is looking like it's going to die, but the rest of them are actually doing quite well, and even better now that I've removed that pebble top layer from the top of the Seramis. Got a few little new roots coming in and a few little new growths, so I'm hoping that these guys will establish a little bit more now. They really took a hit. Obviously they're very small and they were deflasked probably too soon, like I said, but they seem to be doing okay now and kind of establishing, and these ones don't seem to be looking too dehydrated, and we do have some roots down in the pot. Yeah, they just seem to be doing reasonably, but not the best. And the moss ones are kind of terrible, and I'm going to have to do something about this, which is why I'm filming now. I've been super busy recently and I haven't filmed an update as early as I would like, so I am sorry about that, but I'm filming now because I need to do something with these guys. We've only really got 2 plants left in the moss pot. This one's got a couple of roots, so these can be salvaged. I just need to act now. So we're going to sort the moss one out and move it into a different setup, I think. So that is the Sophronitis Arizona crossed with Cattleytonia red rum. More difficult hybrid, I would say. More difficult seedlings, and they were deflasked far too young, so I'm dealing with the consequences of that, really. But otherwise I think that we can get these to bounce back, and obviously I'll continue to update with these guys. Seramis seems to have been a slightly better media for them. So next up we have the one that was labelled as the most difficult, which is the Angraecum eichlerianum. Now this is a relatively rare Angraecum. You don't see it coming up very often, so I snapped up the chance to get the seedlings, and then kind of saw it recommended not for beginners on these guys, and I can vouch for that. They've been a bit fussy. I tried to split between the moss and the Seramis fairly evenly, so I think I put one big and one small in each. The ones in moss have lost the most roots again and are looking kind of the most dehydrated, but we do have quite a big one that's now getting more roots down and establishing in the moss. The Seramis, they seem to have been more of an even curve. They didn't really go downhill to the same extent, but they also haven't grown as fast from kind of what I can remember the growth being, although it could be that I put a bigger one in the moss pot. I can't exactly remember. So I've linked the video up in the corner in the info tab, and also down below in the description for my original deflasking of these guys. So I think that I prefer the Seramis for this one, purely because I haven't really noticed any rot. What I have kind of noticed with the Seramis, when I had the pebble top layer, a few root tips dried and they're now kind of recovering. You can see they're elongating the tips now. So again, that pebble top layer, they just need as much humidity around them as possible, but without rotting them, which is a real kind of oxymoron. But they are kind of recovering the root tips now and hopefully get more roots down into the pot. I can't really see many at the moment in the pot, but they don't look particularly dehydrated or anything. I think they're doing okay. They're just taking a little while to adjust. The ones in moss, I think, look a little bit worse than these guys, but obviously we do have a bigger one in the moss, so it could be that it grew faster. I'm not entirely sure. But we also have one that's lost most of its roots, and the root tips are also kind of dried on these, so that doesn't really make sense either. You see they've kind of lost their growing tips on these two, so I'm hoping that they'll recover them. And this little one on the left looks pretty sorry for itself, but it is growing that little root tip, so there's still hope for it. I am going to leave these in moss because we have this one kind of establishing now, and I really wanted to do a comparison for my environment. That Sophronitis does need to come out though, but I think these guys I will leave in because they're doing okay. Well, one of them's doing okay. One of them is showing vague signs of life, so we'll leave it to it. That is that little cutie. It's doing quite well. It's got quite big. They've definitely grown leaves since I deflasked them. So that is the Angraecum eichlerianum. And I kind of, again, I think the Seramis has been overall a bit more successful. And that could be due to aeration and being less soggy. In terms of the moss, I've probably kept it a little bit too damp, and I did start letting it dry out a little bit more to try and compensate for that. And I feel like I've just not been overly lucky with the moss, unfortunately. And I love moss. I kept all my oncidiums in self-watering with moss for a couple of years, and my seedlings last year I grew in moss and they were fine. So I will of course keep you guys updated with how these are doing, and I'll try to do more regular updates with them. But I need to change this Sophronitis over to a different setup, just because it's in the moss, it's just not thriving at all, and we're at a stage where we're risking losing this now in the moss, and it's not ideal to keep switching their media. But this isn't good, and they don't seem to have done well at all in moss. You would think that Sophronitis would. Maybe the clay media has been slightly cooler as well, because Sophronitis are kind of cooler growing and often lithophytic, so maybe that's to do with it. But we're going to switch the moss Sophronitis over though, and what I'm considering doing is putting it into a little pot with perlite, because I've recently put a couple of my minis into this setup and with a top layer of live sphagnum, and they seem to be doing really well. So I'm going to change that media over now and document them now, and then we can record them at the kind of next update to look at their progress. So I'm going to switch them over now. So I have switched the Sophronitis Arizona crossed with Cattleytonia red rum over from moss into a little self-watering pot that's filled with perlite. Perlite does wick very well and it stays very moist. And I've got a top layer of live sphagnum moss on there. And I've got a couple of little minis, including a Lepanthes, doing very well in this setup. So I'm hoping that this one will be less prone to rot, but also nicely moist because of that live sphagnum top layer. And for the live sphagnum to survive, it does mean that the perlite wicks sufficiently. So just to show you an example, I've got a Lepanthes telepogoniflora here. Excuse how purple it is, it was been far too close to a grow light. It's in a little self-watering pot filled with perlite with a top layer of sphagnum. It's been like this for a couple of months. It's flowering, it seems to be doing very well, and the live sphagnum is surviving. This is one that would be very prone to rot in a more soggy environment, so hoping that the Sophronitis will enjoy this setup. And of course I've put it into a clear pot in a little self-watering pot to try and be able to monitor any root growth as it does happen, if it does happen, and so that you guys can kind of see the progress a bit more. I think clear pots are much more useful when you're filming. So that is my little seedling orchid update, and unfortunately it's not better news, but we've learned from this, and it's about learning what works in your environment. So I definitely think it's a very good idea when you get seedlings, if you can, if you have the opportunity, to try putting them in 2 different setups, because you'll probably find that one works better than the other in your environment, and then you kind of know for next time you do it. And definitely start off with easy seedlings. It's something I've learned. Thanks so much for watching today, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like or subscribe to my channel for more regular orchid updates, and I will see you guys later. Bye!